Okay, cool. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and I'm sitting here with Professor Melissa Koenig, and we're going to chat, I think, about a bunch of stuff, maybe focused around trust, but let's see. So why don't you tell us who you are and what you do? Kick it off from there.
Thanks, Ohan. My name's, Melissa Koenig, and I am a developmental psychologist at the Institute of Child Development here at the University of Minnesota. And very broadly, I'm interested in children's learning from other people, how children make decisions about who to trust, what type of information is available in those channels, and what that reasoning process is like in the early years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you say learning, what kinds of things are you focused on?
Mm-hmm. Well, I started thinking about this, I suppose, in graduate school. I went to the University of Texas at Austin, and just was very interested in kind of language as a source of information, speakers as sources of information, understanding that children, in effect, as learners, are reasoning both about what's being said, and I have a little background in linguistics and in philosophy, and sometimes those fields kind of treat language as this source of information that's disembodied and out there and has distributional properties, etc. And so I was versed in that, but I was also very aware that children are in the real world learning from people like you and me, from human beings, and how do they reason about those beings. And as they learn from others, is there any value in distinguishing the messages from the messengers, and their characteristics and the contexts they occupy when talking about the world, and thus when children are learning about the world? That was kind of the, very broadly, I guess, the things I was thinking about then.
Yeah, and you have, see this interesting thing where children are learning about the world itself, and they have sources through which they learn about the world aside from sort of first-hand experience, but then they're also learning about the sources.
Right.
So you have this sort of meta level learning. And have you looked at also sort of the implicit way that children learn about their sources, or is it more sort of explicit based on what the sources say?
I mean, I think I don't know I think about the terrain in terms of, kind of like you're saying, Ohan, it's like there's the world that's being talked about, that's being testified about. There's the sources of information themselves, often people, but can be all kinds of things. Books, robots, right? Lots of things communicate information. And then there's the messages. This is like this, consider just the information. So I think of the work as often tapping into one, two, sometimes all of these boxes. So I guess one thing I've been most interested in and have learned, I think, a lot about through the work that has been done, not just in our lab, but in many labs, is how children are reasoning about the sources who testify using these messages.
Right.
And I think we've learned a lot from I think even like the weird sources that we've presented them with. So in the early studies, we presented messages that were true as well as messages that were false, and learned, like, from the beginning and throughout all of these studies, learned really interesting things about the reasoning process by presenting children with these false speakers, these inaccurate speakers. Yeah. So I think that reasoning process has been really interesting to learn about. Kids are not just interested, and I don't think anybody's like this, but was fascinating to learn was that as soon as they're in the learning game, as soon as they've got some language, some semblance of a language to work with, say 12 months, 16 months of age, they're interested not in just whether or not a source can be checked off as good or demerited as bad. They're really interested in how you know things, right?
Right, they're looking for justifications in their sources.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And have you seen that children reason based on the quality of justification?
I'm not sure about the yeah, in some sense, yes, but only in some very simple ways. Like quality of justification to me means, do they appreciate a speaker who seems to have an eye for good reasons for their beliefs? And do they prefer those sources over a speaker who seems to be content with bad sources or bad reasons for their beliefs? And yeah, young kids care about that. If you present them with some really lousy reasoners,
Yeah.
Like somebody who justifies their belief by saying, I looked and I saw that P, therefore P is the case, over someone who's happy to guess or it believes that P because they want P to be true. Children realize that their motivated reasoners are problematic in some ways. And so they do show, I think, these preferences that we appreciate as somewhat reasonable or kind of truth apt. So, yeah. But I think I was more impressed by, for example, if you showed a baby, this goes back to kind of the really early studies with the 16-month-olds. If I showed a baby somebody who had access to some simple objects on a screen and labeled them falsely, the baby was immediately interested in that person. Almost like, why could, it's not just that I'm surprised by the false utterance. I'm surprised that it's coming from you, given your access to that screen. Because when we took that false labeler and manipulated their position so that the access was different, then their response to the speaker changed. Now you're no longer that surprising. Your false utterances are a little weird. I'm not clear why you'd be labeling anything under these conditions, but the fact that they're false is explained by the fact that you don't have access to the information. So yeah. The surprise value went down for them.
Right.
So that was amazing to me.
Yeah, it's really interesting because then children are picking up at a very early age that they might be missing information, right? So do you think that if you're curious because somebody that you think might be providing accurate information is providing information that is different from what you expected, then maybe, do you think it's the curiosity purely because the source seems valid enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mm-hmm. It's because I've already learned that you're the type of person, probably, right? You're the type of being who behaves in a certain way when providing me with information, and you're departing from that. And for I think even for these young kids, it never makes me, there were some babies who were somehow like a little disturbed by it. It kind of got an emotional reaction from them. But it was like we broke their heart a little bit that someone would like so cavalierly mislabel the world when they had it. But yeah, I think that most babies and most kids are interested in that person. They're interested in understanding what's going on with you.
Right.
And there was many kids who wanted to help them kind of get on track. So if the person was looking at a ball and saying, "That's a shoe," several babies would go, "Mean this? Do you want to?" You know.
Yeah, right.
So like these expectations are already in place, but like you're interested in, they're interested in what's up here.
Yeah.
You know, there are things that are not as I expect in a domain that's really important to me. This is communication. This is, you know, you're trying to teach me something here apparently, or talk with me about the world, and so they're invested. They're invested in understanding what's going wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's this idea of like the Goldilocks zone of the right amount of information,
Yeah.
right? Where with a kid, it's interesting because you kind of, when you lapse into uncertainty, there's this sort of disconnect, fear. You might get like a strong emotional response, a negative emotional response.
Right.
And then you get something like the everyday, where the child stops paying attention because
This is like
they're
so
just used to
mundane.
it. It's so mundane. And do you think that range is a little wider for children, like the Goldilocks range? Because I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is children are so often observing so much, of course, whereas as adults we kind of hit a slightly narrower range of curiosity where we go about and a lot of things are ignored. It seems like children have this sort of wider perspective.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. I mean, and it comes from, it just comes from the learning problem that they face. That's kind of how I think about it.
Right.
Right? It comes from the learning problem they face. They have to, another way to put what we were just talking about is that the babies have an understanding of what, they're developing an understanding of what intentional actions look like for the community of beings they inhabit and that they coexist with. They're learning about actions like these kind of just even simple grasping, or that if I want to move this phone, my reach has to be a little different. And then the intentional actions of speech and communication, statements, questions, all these different things. They're learning about that too. And so I think if we're interested in if part of what a culture is kind of teaching us, or one of the things we're learning, is how we characterize the many others, the other members of the culture. They have various characteristics, some, personality characteristics even. Reliability would be one of them, but many others. People's curiosity, people's open-mindedness. Before you can get on that train and learn about all those interesting characteristics that make us different from each other, as a child, you have to learn what's in that net. You have to kind of learn. I think it begins with learning about intentional action.
Right.
And then it becomes, oh, this person speaks accurately when discussing why. They're accurate about why. This person is an expert about blah. This person is a biologist. This person has this. So that's just a kind of my crude way of describing what I think is kind of an interest in people, developing into an interest in intentional action, and then that gets more and more nuanced. It crystallizes into these characteristics of people that we learn about, and that we, to the extent that a culture cares about it, we leverage when we interact with each other and learn from each other. Yeah.
Right. So you have certain concepts about types of sources, types of individuals.
Yeah.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
And I guess there are
But
also...
I don't think I don't think a baby has that. I don't think a young child necessarily comes here looking for types.
Mm-hmm.
But that is what we're going to deliver. I do think they'll end up there.
Yeah, because you have this difference in types of trust that a child, especially an infant, is very sensitive to. One is sort of existential, and then the other one is epistemic. right? And so the infant has this existential trust towards the caregiver, right? But the epistemic trust is too abstract. There's no real concept, I would guess. And a child almost learns from any source available. Epistemically, everybody's a valid source because they'll observe if it violates the expectation. But it seems like that existential trust goes from very narrow to something like broadens, and then maybe I haven't
Interesting.
quite verbalized it before, but maybe something like you need the existential net to grow before the epistemic one can sort of mature.
Interesting. Yeah, I've not thought about those two things though. So that's an interesting. Yeah. I think I only thought about it kind of on the epistemic route, but how to connect it to these, what you're calling existential, or what I would call very interpersonal, strong,
Right.
caregiving connections is interesting. And I think kids, obviously we think based on these early life experiences, kids are going to differ in how readily they generalize whatever trust is interpersonal or existential to others. So I don't think it's rampant. I think I think it's variable, and it depends very much on the nature of this early attachment relationship and the extent to which you ask me as a baby to interact with many others, and who are those others? What are they like?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I haven't connected the two
Yeah.
though. That's interesting.
yeah, connected interpersonal and epistemic.
At that, yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't. I mean, I haven't in that early period. Yeah.
But what does that look like sort of as children get a little older?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about children trusting others for information, I think it made sense to perhaps start on a set of epistemic questions about how children estimate others' knowledge. But in the real world, we're mostly making a set of judgments that appeal to at least what I would call epistemic trust, where I'm evaluating what I think you might know about what you're talking about, whatever those cues are, as well as some kind of interpersonal trust judgment, where I'm not just, where it kind of like interpersonal trust starts to depend on what are you asking me to believe from you? What are you asking me to believe? If you're just telling me, like we're having a very scientific or a philosophical discussion, I don't know that there's much interpersonal trust at the table. Personally, I think there's a lot of this other thing going on, a lot of epistemic evaluation, or maybe even if you're really making claims that are supported by arguments or evidence, you're not really asking for much of my trust at all. I'm just evaluating what you say.
Right.
Based on the strength of what I know and on the strength of the reasons you're giving me. I don't even think it's right to really call it trust necessarily, because nobody's vulnerable, nobody's taking any chances. Things are transparent. If you ask me to believe that you are, I don't know, if you ask me to believe that you're going to meet me for coffee tomorrow at 2, then you are starting to ask me to just take you at your word, and that you're going to be there at 2 o'clock. And I'll have some decision to make, and whatever that decision is, it won't necessarily be based on evidence so much. I won't go out and collect a bunch of information or evidence about.
Do they keep their coffee dates? Yeah,
Do they keep their coffee
stood
dates?
me up so many times.
Yeah, I won't do that. You're asking me to trust that you'll be there too.
Right.
And I'll have that decision to make.
Yeah.
About whether to, or that was just the best example I could come up with. But you could imagine I also thought about claims you might want to make about climate change, or claims you might want to make about the current state of our democracy. And when you go into that territory, you might be, if you have reasons and arguments to make, I'll shift over here and we'll have something kind of evidential going on. But if to the extent that you just make a series of claims or state a set of opinions that you might have, then you're asking me to kind of get on board or not, and I may or may not.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think is going on in the interpersonal trust sphere.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So you have this concept that you could ascribe epistemic validity to sources. And it seems like, so one of the things that, as you're speaking, I'm thinking is if two sort of epistemic peers are having a conversation, there isn't so much trust involved, epistemic trust involved. But if there's sort of an imbalance in access, epistemic access, then the trust is there to fill in the gap.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we could have a lot of interpersonal trust, say, as two epistemic peers, but we don't need to rely on epistemic trust because we're looking for each other's justifications when we're having a conversation.
That's
because
right.
We're peers.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I never really thought of trust as something that fills in a gap, but that's quite an interesting way to think about it. Yeah.
What's her name? There's the philosopher who's done a lot of work on climate change, Naomi. I think blanking on her last name.
I'm not sure.
And, she points out that so much of what you and I, assuming we're not climate scientists,
right,
so much of what you and I believe about the state of the planet is based on a kind of trust.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So there's a huge difference in what the experts know and what I know. But anything I claim to know, I know based on even on the trust I've put into their words, what I take to be their review of the evidence and all of the methods that created the science.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a trust in the individuals and a trust in the processes that are reflected there. So I do think of it as, in that case, filling a kind of gap.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we can even update what we believe. So it's actually quite a powerful mechanism, right? Because I can update what I believe given the outcome of the individuals I trust. So climate science, I can develop beliefs about climate change that almost are distinct from my beliefs about the validity of climate scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And so that ends up being quite an interesting thing, is they can weigh on each other. Yeah. I can determine whether or not a climate scientist ought to be trusted based on whether or not they believe in climate change.
Right.
Right? So that, that small percentage of climate scientists that are out there claiming climate change isn't human-made.
Yeah.
I can doubt their validity.
Yeah.
But they're the climate scientists. So there's this interesting
That's right.
That's
right. And you're monitoring consensus too, right?
Yeah.
They're minority.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's the important thing also, is like consensus ends up playing a huge role here. Whereas, if kind of thing we were chatting about yesterday, if we wake up tomorrow and a majority of climate scientists are like, oh, we're wrong about climate change, then there's this question here of in which direction do we update our beliefs?
Yeah.
There's sort of, I think we account for that in terms of likelihood and precedence and consensus, and we're like, okay, well, it's an incredibly unlikely event where all these climate scientists say that they were wrong.
But we would be interested in why.
We'd be interested in why.
And we would definitely expect to hear why.
Yeah, exactly.
We would evaluate that.
We would demand the credibility.
That's right.
Right.
So see that. So even in this example, it's so kind of nice to see this line up. Even for me, it's like we're doing what I think even a baby is ready to do We are interested in, when we're evaluating testimony, we're immediately interested in the source, in the knowledge of the source.
Right. Right.
We're immediately interested in your access, in your ability to access the relevant information. So we're just not interested in getting, simplistically true beliefs and making sure our true beliefs outnumber the false ones. It's not like that. It's much more dynamic. It's much more engaged with the epistemology of the agents themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Gilbert Ryle, I don't know if you know
Yeah,
him.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
This is what I
Yep.
mean, this is one of the things I like to cite him for is that kind of insight. He was right when he was onto that.
Yeah. Ryle's epistemics and work on identities really definitely has informed a lot.
Yeah.
So I definitely hear you there.
Yeah.
And so the work that you do has also shifted also to include things like bias, right? So can you tell me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, along the way, as when the team of scientists that were interested in how we make these decisions to trust someone over another. So in these paradigms, we often present like speaker A and speaker B, and speaker A has some characteristics and speaker B maybe lacks that characteristic or has a different set of characteristics. And we ask the child to learn those characteristics in a kind of brief history trial or a familiarization phase. Let's say they learn that one speaker is repeatedly accurate and the other person is not. Or one person is kind of repeatedly pro-social and the other is not. And then we ask children which of these two information sources they might prefer. We started to get a handle on, or at least I felt like I was getting a handle on, and our conversation so far has alluded to this, on what kind of reasoning is available to the child who's reasoning about this choice between two speakers, but also the child who's just faced with the problematic speakers. And then along the way, people started to include group markers, right? Speakers who were not to be characterized in terms of their behavior, but were to be kind of characterized in terms of how they present and in how they look. And a lot of minimal group, a lot of, it's kind of a favored, simple manipulation with a white middle class convenience sample here in the US, is to just see what happens if you've got a red shirt on, the child has a red shirt on, and you're facing two people. One has a red shirt and the other who has a purple shirt, for example. And it's interesting, that shared shirt color does indeed seem to matter for the young kids.
Yeah.
And so I guess I started to do a study or two myself and got interested in the literature that I was reading, which gained more and more steam. And I just am currently interested in, how do I understand that? How do I understand that kind of reasoning about information from speakers who only really differ in terms of group membership? And it's going to be a variable and interesting set of answers, because not all group markers are created equal.
Right.
They're not just of a piece.
Yeah.
They're interesting and different.
And so you've also included group markers that exist out in the world, not just minimal group markers.
That's right.
And so I think that's like quite interesting, and also to the benefit of our understanding, right? Because a lot of the work that's out there, including my own, is minimal groups, right? So how do we sort of leverage that, especially with children?
Right.
Because previously what I was doing with adults was not minimal, it was sort of beliefs out in the world. climate change, social justice, sort of capital punishment, things like that, you know. But with children, it's sort of difficult to get that. But obviously, race and gender appear so early in children's thinking and in children's biases, and how they deal with testimony from adults and things like that. So,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. I wish I can't. I don't know that I can say much definitively. But, you know, with my colleagues, Charisse Pickron here at ICD, and students Norwood Glaspie and Yunju Se, we were asked to write a chapter for a handbook on belief, and that's Tanya Lombroso and someone
cool.
else is
Yep.
editing.
Forthcoming?
Forthcoming.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
And so we kind of put our heads together and tried to stay focused on those studies that weren't looking at minimal groups, that were really focused on racial groups. And what are we learning here? And what kind of reasoning might be going on? And so I can't say, you know, I can't say we have any firm conclusions, but like it does, like, for example, what immediately comes into light is, you know, when you're growing up as a infant, and you're growing up, let's say you're the firstborn, and you have two parents who are some primary sources of information for you, you're learning, like, these are what knowledgeable others look like for me. You're not just learning, you're learning this is, you know, you're learning what knowledgeable others look like for me, and you're learning also what my caregivers look like for me. And so there's all these interesting questions about, well, do you expect knowledgeable others to look certain kinds of ways? We should do these studies.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the studies I think one should do.
Yeah, because then it's because so much of bias is the context that you're sort of brought up in, and then you have a certain point at which you can start getting past those biases of your context, and it really is, again, sort of how your context is shaped and matured as you get older, how you shift. But early on, it's so limited by what your parents look like, what your parents' friends look like, what your other relatives look like.
Right. And then as you grow up and you start getting out there a little bit more and more, then you have to reconcile what the culture is telling you a knowledgeable person looks like.
Right.
And that's a major source of bias, right?
Yeah.
That's the one we're kind of really to be wary of, or to have our eyes on.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, yeah, those are the kinds of things that I'm kind of excited to learn more about.
Right. Which is kind of why it's so important to have sort of scientists of color in the forefront, right?
Mm-hmm.
That a child is used to seeing a white male as a scientist, and if that's all you see on television, and your parents are white, then how do you come into the world understanding that every human has the potential for epistemic validity as a trusted source?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult if you're growing up in a very white environment.
Yeah.
Right, without the diversity in your programming, like in PBS.
Exactly, and representation is important. And not only that, it's important to start to also look at how are those people talked about in your household.
Right.
So testimony about others will be crucial. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? Is nothing said when the 6 o'clock news comes on and the anchor is black and reports on a story, is nothing, is anything discussed? Is anything made of this or that? Or are you watching any scientific television, anything on PBS? Yeah, how are people being portrayed? I guess in the media would be one main source of information about the culture's views. Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
you have, it was, their name is Youngjun, right?
Yeonju.
Yeah, Youngjun. And you're on this work as well with testimony in adults?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that work is really cool.
You like that?
Yeah, because
Parent doing the testifying.
parent doing the testifying.
Yeah.
Because you never get that,
I know.
right? It's so cool that you.
I'm so glad you validated that. I don't think
Yeah.
she realized how special that is.
No, it's so cool.
I like it.
Yeah. I told her as much. I thought it was
Good.
really great, and yeah, because I got to sit through her sort of a mock presentation
Good.
of that work, and I
I
think
love it too. She's so careful.
yeah,
Yeah.
because the setup is you have the research assistant and the child's bearing witness to the adult giving testimony about to an individual from a particular group, and it's really interesting because she has a setup where one is where the research assistant is asking the adult for what they think about the person, and the other one, the adult is explicitly saying to the child, this person is not trusted, this person is, and that's really phenomenal. I mean, the ecological validity of that
Exactly.
is phenomenal.
I know.
It's super cool.
And she's getting these really big effects. It's just, and this is about building on some work I've done with Pearl Lee, but also this work by John Lane and
Right. Right.
Josh Rotman and Condor. Emily Condor, I believe, is
cool.
the
Okay.
other author. And whenever for anyone who has cared to look and compared direct testimony where the child is the recipient and I am telling you X about some social group directly, versus I'm saying something over here to a third party and the child is left to overhear it for interesting reasons that I don't think an epistemic trust model could explain. There are always interesting differences found there. Where learning occurs, it's not like they're not learning from an overheard condition.
Yeah.
That input is pernicious as well. If it's negative, if it's a negative messaging about social groups. But if you're being directly addressed, all the more uptake.
Yep.
All the more.
Yeah.
And that to me is, that's important to explain. And if the evidence is the same, the words are the same.
Right.
What's different is how it's being presented and how then the child is being asked to receive it.
Yeah, and you get this.
That's interesting to me. That's the interpersonal part.
That's the interpersonal part. That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Because you get this thing where she finds that as the children get a little older, the direct testimony stays constant, but the indirect testimony sort of drops a little.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting thing where, as children start exploring more, they start taking recommendations less, but they're still able to follow rules. And so do you think it's something like that where anything that the parent says this is really important, they're able to integrate that, but then opinions become less important, and it seems like the indirect testimony is more opinion-like. Right?
Maybe. Yeah, that's one way. That's one way to think about it. Yeah, the way I've talked about it is similar. It's kind of like, if you're directly addressing me and you're making claims, remember they're not based on any evidence.
Yeah.
You're asking for my trust. You're asking me to trust you in this interpersonal exchange, and I have now taken your word. Whereas if you're not directly addressing me, you're talking to someone else, then what I'm receiving is evidence. I'm receiving evidence to that effect. And it's just it's weaker.
Wow.
It's like, you could call it opinion. It's like, but if you directly addressed me with your opinion, I would be in this, and I'm a young child and you're my parent, I would probably consent and I would trust, and if I did that, there'd be all the more uptake. And that's where I've just written a little bit with an epistemologist, Ben McMyler, and talked through and read his work, and he's fortunate enough to be here in the Twin Cities, and I've talked with him about this a lot, and there's just this, I don't know, the way he thinks about it is there's this dynamic process here between two people, and if I've asked you to take me at my word, which is what's happening in the direct condition, and the child says, well, okay, the child he thinks there's some shared epistemic responsibility for this belief now. And part of the reason I can now take it on is because if it turns out to be problematic in any way, I can go back to you. You're partly responsible for it. So now you and I have shared responsibility for this belief you and I have just shook hands on. Something like this.
That's really interesting.
And yeah.
Do you think...
Whereas over here, it's like, well, strength of the evidence is this. I overheard her say X about this group. I believe it to some degree with whatever probability, and if something comes along and I have to revise it, I will.
Yeah, right.
It's on the Bayesian train.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Especially because a child might feel like a greater interpersonal demand. Is that part of it? You know, like there are demand characteristics.
Yeah, that's a way to think about it. It's a demand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean... Yeah.
In an adult setting, we'd be like, well, look, it's up to you. It's up to you what you do. You're the epistemic agent. I'm not going to force your hand. But if you do trust me, that's the decision you've made.
Yeah, I like the idea of also the sort of shared responsibility is really cool.
I like that too.
And there's also something about like, if I say something to you expecting you to trust me on that, and then I find out that you're kind of looking it up to see if I'm right, I might be wounded.
That's right.
Right. I don't know if a child is thinking that, but an adult definitely would.
That's right.
Right.
I like that. I like it for that part too. I was like, we know that there's a cost to not believing, a social cost to not believing someone, and we feel that.
No.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, this is why like so much of work on trust to me ends up also going to signaling, because there's so much of reputation management involved in trust, right? Of I will accept because I have to signal something to you, or I'm going to hold a belief like just to show you that I hold that belief. So
that you and I can be okay.
So you and I can
There's
be
all
okay.
this relational stuff.
Yeah.
And this, and if we're just talking about learning and knowledge and estimating, we're not in that. We're not close enough to that.
Right.
So that's
Exactly. Yeah. So many considerations.
Right.
I mean, and the interesting thing is how, like the video that Nord Glaspie showed us yesterday, right? With somebody who has adopted the belief that critical race theory is bad, but hasn't really filled out that belief with content. It sort of sounds content about critical race theory.
Yeah.
But that it's sort of a signaling thing that has become part of their belief structure, but that belief structure only has the sentence critical race theory bad.
Good.
No content about the critical race theory itself.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, it makes me want to kind of dive in a little bit more into something like belief, strength of belief, action.
Right.
You can imagine filling it all out. How is your belief strong, so strong that you're willing to act in accordance with it? Is your belief strong but not strong enough to support your action? Is your belief weak but you're willing to act on it, like in the case of this dude?
Right.
Or is your belief weak and your action weak, and you're kind of not so much of a threat?
Right. And by strength here, you're taking like how fleshed out in content, but not necessarily like strength and valence for the individual, right?
Right.
Or okay, just clarify.
Yeah.
Okay. I see.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking it through that far, so you're right to push me on it. I guess I'm thinking, how would they answer almost like a certainty question maybe about it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you
Not so much the valence. I hadn't even factored that in. That would
okay,
blow up my 2x2.
Yeah,
But yeah.
because I think that's interesting. Like what I was asking adults with political cognition in the MA was three things. It was how much they agreed with a particular statement. So it was like on strength of agreement, and they were sort of coded in various ways. And then how important that belief was to them, to their sense of self, right? So this sort of prioritization sort of thing. And then how knowledgeable they thought they were. But I didn't ask any questions about the thing, just how knowledgeable they thought they were about the thing.
Oh, interesting.
And so that was really interesting. So sort of having these three, because you can think that a certain statement is very correct, but you can say that's not so important for me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is when the thing that was very highly correlated, we're talking like, you know, almost 0.9, was how important it is to me and how knowledgeable I think I am.
Wow.
Right? Because there's
that makes sense.
because that's how you kind of want to believe that you are justified epistemically. That's kind of how I interpreted it, right? But you can have a very strong belief also in something like your agnosticism about something.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So those were highly correlated, those two things.
Yeah, those two things were highly correlated. Yeah, that would be.
And is that written up? Is that a paper?
It's a paper. It's an unpublished paper, but it's a paper. Yeah, I should send that to you.
I would love to see it.
I would love to get your take on it.
It was how important for me, how knowledgeable do I think I am,
and how much I agree with the statement. So it would be statements like humans are currently contributing to the warming of the global climate, or humans are not currently contributing to the warming of the global climate. So we'd have like, you know, that sort of counterbalance in terms of direction, and then we'd get their agreement score with that. And then the topic of climate change is very important to me, and we get the rating on that, and I'm very knowledgeable about climate change.
Interesting.
And so these three things, because what we were looking at, kind of coming back to this sort of the epistemic, the trust aspect, is what we were looking to do is create a belief profile of individuals and say these sets of people have these types of beliefs. And what we would show them was people who very highly prioritized the things that they highly prioritized, and then show them things that they didn't have strong beliefs on out of the same sort of 20 items, and then say that you've diverged from the group on these sets of things, and then see if they would sort of readjust what they believe based on what the group believed, right? So I have strong beliefs about queer rights and climate change and capital punishment, but I have very low prioritized beliefs. I think I'm not very knowledgeable on whether we should regulate AI and whether AI is a threat.
Yeah.
But my group thinks that AI is a threat and should be regulated. Does that impact what I think? You know? And it's like, oh, is there a social justice component to AI? Who knows how people are sort of factoring that in, but they do. They take this as a valid sort of source. No reason. It's just my group thinks this about this topic.
Yeah.
You know? And the interesting thing is, if you all of a sudden take that group and, you know, two of my most important beliefs are queer rights and climate change. If I say like, oh, but these people don't have the opposite view in queer rights from you, that's all of a sudden just not my group. You know, because it's very important to me. So, oh, this is just some weird group that believes in climate justice but not social justice, you know? And all of a sudden it no longer becomes my group, and then their beliefs about AI don't matter to me anymore. It's not my group anymore.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
So it's like we need the same prioritized belief set if I'm going to take you as a valid source on politicized topics, you know, what I see as politicized topics.
Interesting. So even if you claim some other thing is important to you, you and I can share 3 political topics in common in terms of their importance. But you also think something's important that I don't. You start to become a non-group member. It weakens your ability to be an influential source for me on the things we share.
It's less neutral than that. It's not that I believe something's important that you don't. It's that we both believe it's important, but we have opposing views.
I see.
You know?
Okay.
Yeah. It's that like I'm more ready to accept.
I see.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I got you.
So because it's interesting, right? Like I'm willing to accept somebody who's not so interested in climate justice, but is in queer rights and economic justice. But if they actively don't believe, then it's just
then
we are not in the same group.
That's the yeah. So yeah, that's the significance of disagreement.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it shows like how how siloing happens, right?
Yeah.
Second
Yeah.
wave feminism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
uh, yes, so trans exclusion in feminism, and so like these really interesting things of we can agree on these
Exactly.
things, but what is going
Exactly.
on? You know, with the
Exactly.
holistic, the intersectional nature of this, and that's the difficult part, right? Yeah, because there's when we that's part of the fracturing, you know, which then leads, I think, also people down like different rabbit holes, right? You can get trans exclusionary folks going very right wing, but then keeping some small aspect of a value
Right.
that we might agree with, but nothing else.
Yeah. 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 No, that's really interesting and helpful for explaining, yeah, how movements lose their members.
Yeah.
And it's justified. It's often justified.
Mm-hmm.
It can be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because what I thought you stood for, you don't stand for.
Yes. Exactly.
In the
exactly.
history of social movements, yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess, what do you make of things like, how, have you ever worked on like the recovery of trust? It's like how, because that's one thing that I've been really interested in, you know, like what is penance, you know, in that?
Right. No, not as much as I would, like to share. We did, and this is one of those file drawer studies, unfortunately. But we would like, I think it probably just needs a follow up. But we did, on this shared responsibility for the lost trust.
Yes, nice.
We set up for kids a situation where there was a main informant who was informing a learner, and this main informant was misinforming the learner, but she got her information from an outside source who misinformed her. So it's true that she directly misinformed our learner, but in a sense, not by her own power. She did so because she herself was misinformed. So we wanted to see, who would children blame in this scenario?
Right.
Where's the problem? And who would they credit when things go well? So it turns, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Pearl Lee is again the one deserving of credit for this this collaboration, this project. When things are going well and the information moving through is true, children, I think, are basically ready to credit kind of both sources. They're like, yes, you're correct, then you're correct, and you were correct to learn from her, and you were correct to transmit it. Everybody's to be credited.
Nice.
But something like that. But when the bad information that you transmitted came from an outside source, suddenly that person does bear a good deal of responsibility. She's not blameless. She passed it on. But the child is ready to say, that's not good. It wasn't like they were like 50-50, you're both bad. It was like, really go after this problematic person who misinformed her.
Right, the original source.
The original source.
Right.
And you kind of get a pat on the wrist for being complicit and passing it on. So that's just a little bit of the surface we've scratched on a question like that. But I think it's really important.
Yeah.
And I also want to think about it in terms of both interpersonal and maybe the evidential. We keep using a climate change example where, if you tell me that you're going to meet me for coffee at 2 tomorrow, and maybe you keep doing this, and you keep telling me we're going to meet at 2 tomorrow, we're going to meet at 3 the next time, and you keep letting me down, I'm right to have a set of attitudes that are of disappointment, betrayal might be strong, but something in that neighborhood, resentments.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the Peter Strawson territory in philosophy,
Yeah,
and that's been really helpful in just understanding people's reactive attitudes. But if you're Naomi, Dr. Naomi, who's the climate expert I keep referring to, and you tell me that about these climate disasters and that climate change is human made. And let's say, just in this hypothetical, you turn out to be wrong. What's going on? Do I have are the climate scientists, are they blameless? Do we hold any of these attitudes? Here the philosophers don't agree. I don't think they agree. I think we might be a little disappointed, but at the end of the day, what were we doing? It's true there was some taking people's word for things, but we were also evaluating evidence ourselves. We were evaluating a process ourselves. And so if it turns out to be wrong at the end of the day, maybe we're going to update a whole set of beliefs about maybe the processes, maybe even the evidence. Mm-hmm. It doesn't all land on Dr. Naomi in the way that it does when I've learned about a social group from my parent or from my friend, and I've just taken up a whole bunch of stock claims based on nothing but your word and my confidence in your word.
Yeah, there's this, so much is sort of placed on the process, right? The process of the information gathering, the validation. Yeah.
Right. So when I believe Dr. Naomi, do we enter into some kind of shared responsibility? I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But even if I did, I don't have anything to really go on here. There's no relationship at stake. There's nothing to modulate or calibrate like there is in the case of human relationships, interpersonal relationships that we're involved in, that we participate in.
I mean, you get certain points at which we adjust what we take to be significant, we adjust how we do science. So there's sort of the philosophy of science, the applied epistemics, which is constantly trying to figure out ways to make the findings more reliable, right? So that we can be further justified in what we think.
Yeah.
And I think that's also sort of a great testament to the fact that science is an evolving process for the reason that we want to have better claims.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So the extent that those processes are in place and gaining steam, that will take even more. That'll take even more responsibility off of an individual expert, right? Because you're putting all this out there for us. The transparency is only going up.
Yeah.
For the consumer to evaluate.
Yeah, because whenever we look at scientific theories of the past that have been overturned, we don't blame individuals who believed the scientific theory of the past.
No.
There was good reason for it, and it's only because of a mountain of evidence that we were able to overturn that, and now we believe something else.
Exactly.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, so that's quite interesting when you look at, say, the studies you're mentioning that you, hopefully that you'll pick back up, right, which is about who's responsible. Because if somebody is actually, I'm thinking, right, like if somebody tells me something and I find out that they reliably relayed the information, like say a science journalist, if they report on something that is, even if it's patently false, but they took a scientist's word for it and they reported exactly what the scientist thought, maybe there's something about consensus and research there. But the scientist is at fault, and I can trust the journalist is relaying things accurately from the scientist at least.
Right.
So there's something interesting there.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's two folks in our department actually working on responsibility, and one is on responsibility of actions, Katerina Kovacevic, and she's doing some really cool stuff like. Could you possibly have gathered the information to know that your actions could harm somebody? Is that access available to you and you didn't access it? or it was available and you avoided accessing it intentionally. So this sort of thing about the access to information about potential harm, and Francesca Bonalumi, who now they're also working together on a couple of projects, who worked on, like you were mentioning before, specifically about things like we're supposed to meet and you didn't meet me.
Yeah.
Right? Who's at fault? Are commitments implicit? If we meet every Wednesday at 2, do I have a responsibility to tell you that I'm not going to be there next Wednesday at 2?
Yeah.
You know, there are implicit commitments there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it ends up being quite interesting, you know, of what kinds of things what kinds of reactions you can expect from the individual who's expecting that that consistency.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know in the developmental sphere also.
Yeah, exactly. Because
Right.
they're not working with kids; they're working with adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's worth following.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put one more thing to you.
Sure.
The something that Francesca did with children is a child is in a situation where the experiment tells them that say one of their toys has been broken, and it's possible that they can check in one of two bags, either it's either a bully's bag or their friend's bag, or a neutral classmate and their friend's bag.
Okay.
And they children often avoid looking in their friend's bag,
Oh, wow.
even if it's likely that the friend did it.
Really?
Because it's hurtful if your friend
Yeah.
did something bad
You
to
don't,
you.
there's the information you don't want.
You don't want, you know? And they, with the bully, they will check only if the bully won't know they checked, right? Because there's a negative repercussion for gathering the information, which is from the bully themselves.
Yeah.
But with the friend, there's a negative repercussion for me, for like my emotional state. And that's so interesting, you know, that children are already being, by, I think she starts with age 5, to say like, I wouldn't look. And whereas with the bully, it's conditioned on the bully knowing. Whereas the friend, it's never conditional on, they just don't want to know.
I love that.
Right?
I really love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really do. Yeah, I think it's so fruitful to hear that people are thinking about actively avoiding information. And what motivates that, you know? Is there a good literature in social psychology about this?
Yeah, I think the most interesting stuff comes with healthcare research.
Okay.
I think that's the most robust. With people really avoiding information that's negative about potentially very scary sort of healthcare
Right,
diagnoses.
that's right.
And then things like bureaucracy, like taxes, and
Yeah,
you know, things like that. So that kind of information, which makes sense. I mean, the negative affective state that we're going to be in when we access the information makes me really want to avoid that information.
Yes.
And yeah, bureaucracy is crushing.
Yeah.
So the worst of human inventions.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. It feels so, I really feel so good getting my taxes done every year. And in a way that I shouldn't have to, but it is because the bureaucracy is so intimidating. You know. And there's yeah. And it does feel like, whew,
Yeah.
yeah. Cleared another one. Cleared another year.
So I think we've been chatting for almost an hour.
Great.
So let me ask you why it is you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. In life or in science?
Both.
Okay.
That would be great.
Okay. Good. Let's see. Well, in the science domain, I think there are two things that are really motivating for me. One is this ability to be engaged in conversations with interesting people.
Tell me about it.
Really interesting people about questions we both find hopefully not just interesting, but also impactful. So, one of the projects I've been very excited about these days is this collaboration with Gail Ferguson and Charisse Pickron on really how white families are or are not talking about race, racism, racial inequality, and what kinds of supports, incentives, structures would support conversations that the data shows they're not that interested in having, or many families are not interested in having. So anytime, anytime our questions and our methods can come together to just do work that can point in a number of different fruitful directions on matters that really impact many lives. I'm very happy to be part of just even a small part of those conversations. The other part of the science that I really love is supporting young scientists. Really, really, I think it's become more and more true for me in my own professional life, is to be really inspired and invested in the careers of younger people. And really, I mean, the doctoral students that I'm just honored to work with here at ICD, and I think even at times like these, with the kind of the profound moment we're in nationally, and what it's meaning for our science here in the U.S., it could not be more true. It could not be more critical to do all that we can to protect and support the really important and sometimes courageous work that young people are doing and ready to do, and that I believe in and we believe in. So that motivates me. Those two things really motivate me. Yeah, and I think in I guess in life in general, I feel like the more I'm able to kind of connect ethical dots between my own self and my own decisions, my own actions, and my work life. Yeah, the I don't know. Just the more human, I suppose, I feel, and I think the more human the institutions that I'm participating in hopefully are. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really something that comes through in the work that you've been putting out, and I know a lot of people appreciate the kind of thing you're doing, which is that you specifically haven't sacrificed social justice, your beliefs for science and for the scientific work, and not really deluding any of us into thinking that there needs to be a separation.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and so it's immensely valuable to see you being able to do that over an impressive career.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's very nice to hear. It's giving me, I think, a lot of credit, because I do think I've, you know, I don't know that I was even, I think I saw even my path a little more divergent in my early career. I kind of was like deciding between, to be honest, I really was deciding in my 20s between a life that was more overtly engaged, and I was in the Peace Corps and making decisions like this, and science. And then I felt, and I was worried that the scientific route or even the psychology route was going to entertain me and maybe a few other people, but it wasn't going to be of much consequence. And so as I got just a little more mature, maybe even a little more confidence in my ability to do some good work, I think I've increasingly appreciated that there's really a lot of ways to be engaged. You don't want to put all of your eggs in one thing. Keep it all open.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I don't know, I think we have to stand by what we do and believe in it, what it can do, but also have some humility about what we can do scientifically when it comes to the real inequity that's out there.
Right. That the research on its own is not enough.
Right.
It's a step.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you also were doing activism around labor?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right on. Yeah. And what did that look like?
Back in the day, it was, it was just kind of like supporting striking workers in Detroit, because I was in Ann Arbor at the time, and being a part of certain coalitions. Jobs with Justice was one of them that was active in the Midwest and supporting different unions, and that's a really great area for labor. Michigan is, or it was at the time, and Teamsters for a Democratic Union was kind of coming to be, and right, it was a cool critical movement on the old Teamsters union, and all of those little cool kind of rebellious fractures were starting to gain momentum, and a bunch of us were just interested in learning from them. And there were some people with real grassroots organizing experience, and just getting a real education in what people with a lot of power can do if it's not checked. And that was a good education.
Yeah, right.
A really good education. And so, yeah, I'll always be up for, supporting people who face sources of power that seem to have no interest in holding themselves accountable, which is usually the case. And so there's some very honest means of doing that. Yeah. So, the graduate students here at the University of Minnesota now are represented by a union, and I'll be interested to see if in this landscape whether more and more people find a way.
I love that.
Yeah. You too. Do you also, excuse me, have an interest in labor?
Yeah. It's the fact that we can be born into a system where we must work for capital.
Yeah.
And that work can be unprotected.
That's right.
That the not working is an existential threat and working is an existential threat is absurd.
Yeah.
It's an unbelievable dilemma to be placed between. And it's one of the many injustices that we face on an everyday level from society, despite the fact that we've all sacrificed certain things to engage in a social contract, to be participants in it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's, I think the one, I guess I also have faith in labor as a movement, because even folks who think that you can support labor without social justice, and those folks exist. You know, there's sort of, I guess I see labor, aside from being important as an issue on its own, as being sort of a singular unifying factor that might then bridge that empathy gap.
Yeah.
Right? Of, oh, we're the same, and oh, maybe there's some extra marginalization that other folks are incurring, and maybe it helps that, you know.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of what I'm hopeful for and lean on. In that, just a very sort of personal anecdote, with my sort of parents being Armenians escaping persecution in Turkey. Like, we grow up with this narrative, and they come here and they're white to America.
Yeah.
So, like, obviously we grow up in whiteness with all the white privilege, and we grow up with stories of persecution, and like that, I think, was crucial to sort of growing up as a white man in the United States, allowed that the beginning of that social justice framework in. And I don't know what it would have looked like otherwise, you know, of somehow, you know, going from, in the beginning, even conflating the Black American struggle with the Armenian struggle, which is obviously not comparable at all. But sort of through that mistake, you know, in youth, sort of in my teens, understanding, oh, obviously they're very different things, but that bridge into empathy was always there.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
and so that, I guess that's what I see labor as being good for.
Yeah.
Is
I think
that,
a lot of people feel that way.
I hope so.
I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Come
Exactly. The class struggle.
on. Yeah.
Right? Like, you eliminate class,
Yeah.
and a lot of things also, you know, go away. Everything, a lot of things fall under class.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of people with their eyes. I mean, Angela Davis. Come on. I mean, a lot of really the leadership, a lot of strong voices have been beating this drum for a long, long time, and it's always speaks to me because it's always sounded the same. That drum.
Yeah.
Even now, 1975, 1925, you know, it's the right drum. And if you pull on one lever, like you were saying, a little too much, you get a little out of balance. And I think there is some hope that, I like the way you put it, that not working is an existential threat, and working, if that becomes an existential threat, something's really wrong, and you would like to find some unification and integration, around that. But then it gets back to the kind of, you know, then you have to really know your literature, know your history, so that you don't make these mistakes of becoming the thing that is about this, but not that.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
And that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about the sort of intersectional heroes like Angela Davis, you know, who serves prison time for what she's championing, you know, and Bell Hooks, who you have your students read, which I think is amazing.
Yeah.
You know, I haven't heard of that before. You know, she's amazing. You know, to ask folks who are studying psychology and cognitive science to read Bell Hooks, I think is phenomenal.
You know, she's so good at writing in All About Love, for example, about her childhood.
Yeah.
And she will tell you, you know, when she was a student in a predominantly black school, she knew she was learning kind of some tools of resistance.
Yeah.
resistance and resilience. It was like, that's just what it was to be in the 4th grade or in the 6th grade. That's what it was. And we, the teachers knew your family, and your family knew your teachers. They knew what was going on with you. And then to be bused to the white school and to see what changed in that atmosphere. Now it was about following directions and being the good student in the classroom and learning whatever I decide to teach you. And it's not about resistance anymore.
Yeah. It's about complacency, getting
It's
in
about
line.
it's about
complicity.
falling in line.
Yeah.
And learning the dominant culture's rules.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much of a colonial mindset even when you're not leaving your own home, Even when you're not leaving your own country, there's something about that sort of innate colonialism of,
Right.
Yeah.
And when one mind can see these two worlds that clearly and can articulate it that well and that beautifully, then let's get interested in that dominant culture, shall we?
Yeah.
Right? Let's get interested in how a child learns to become a part of that dominant culture. That seems to me worth studying.
Damn.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why the class exists, and that's what, that's what I would like to see animate if I'm, ever successful in getting what would be private foundation funding. It would be interest in that type of question. And so that's why I thought it was super valuable for you to visit our class this week and just think, even the clever little scenarios you're presenting them with about autocrats and democrats and material interests and social interests, and it was really, very, really helpful.
Yeah. That means a lot, and hopefully we can, keep it going, and especially with groups that are out there in the world,
Right.
and really test these things and see if it's the same. See what people are bringing in that we try to sort of strip them of out of convenience.
Yeah.
And inject that back in and see what happens.
Yeah. And I'm from, you're from New York, you said, right?
Yeah.
So you've driven and you're doing a road trip. You drive through a lot of white America, rural America. That's where I grew up. I mean, I grew up in a really kind of a large rural community with lots of family, and I just feel like those would be the children I'd love to understand a little bit better next.
Yeah, well.
Move outside of these, like the urban settings, and move outside of the well-educated, high SES groups, and into just get a sense for the levers of change, or the things we want to understand about these families. What are the value systems we want to understand, just to get a better sense of what it means to be enculturated.
Yeah, because when you look at the United States, we're talking about 330 million people.
It's true.
It's an outrageously large amount of people.
Yeah.
And America is so unique in a number of large cities that are such small percentages of the population.
Yeah.
I mean, you take some countries, like throughout Europe, the capital city might be 25% of the population, 33% of the population.
Right.
The United States, New York is 9 million out of 330. I know. So it's just, the urbanization is a completely different thing here. Yeah. Cities that are world famous are, you take Denver and they've got, 600,000 people in it?
Right.
And people in Europe have heard of Denver, but they've never heard of countries in a neighboring country, or towns in a neighboring country that might have that much. And so that's a really strange phenomenon about the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how they're reasoning about inequality. Let's take a look. That's
super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that grant funding come through you.
Yeah,
so
great.
So we can learn a bunch of stuff.
Good. Me too. Also, I will look up Julia Leonard. who you mentioned.
Oh yeah.
And maybe she'll be at
I'll just put you
SFTU.
two on an email. I think that'll be better.
Okay.
And worth mentioning the researcher I did, like the professor I did the MA work with, which I'm going to send you, is Ayşecan Bodroğlu.
Oh yeah.
Ayşecan's phenomenal scientist. She's
he?
really cool.
She?
She's in Istanbul at Koç University now.
Great.
Yeah. She's does really great work.
Do you know somebody named Jedediah Allen?
Of course.
So
Oh yeah.
I don't know if I should say this.
Oh yeah.
But
yeah.
he and I have been in touch, and I think I have a standing invitation to visit.
Oh man.
Bilkent.
At Bilkent, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
He was
I
almost on my MA thesis committee.
Okay.
Yeah. He was like a scheduling conflict.
Okay.
But he's great.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
If you go to Istanbul, I'll meet you there.
Really?
I go like twice a year.
Okay, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
It's definitely on my. It's very high on my list of international travel.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's keep talking about end the episode there.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Johan.